go ahead and kind of get started, because we know that y'all obviously have jobs and we don't want to hold your time for too long. Let me introduce myself. I'm Charlotte Getz. For those of you who I haven't met, I am the former editor-in-chief of the Rooted blog and have switched roles here. I'm the director of publishing projects. We're working on some books and exciting things like that. And Anna Harris, who could not be on this call today, she is the current editor-in-chief of the Rooted blog. And Chelsea, I'll let you introduce yourself, Chelsea.
Yeah, so I'm Chelsea. I am the youth ministry editor here at the blog. And I also serve in full-time ministry as the pastor of youth and families at a church in Hamilton, Massachusetts. And I apologize, my internet connection is a little unstable today because I'm working from a hotel. We're displaced from our home for a couple of nights for a reno project we're working on. But so good to be with y'all and really excited to, for those faces we know, for y'all to be, encouraged hopefully and encourage others. And the new people, we're just so excited to have you and your interest in the blog. So.
Okay, so before we get going, Chelsea, would you mind saying a quick prayer for us?
Absolutely. Let's pray. God, we thank you so much for who you are and for your grace to us in Jesus, for the way that each of us has experienced that in our own lives. And what a joy it is to be able to share that with teenagers, to be able to point them to you through our work and ministry and hopefully through our lives as well, God. And we thank you for the ministry of Rooted that has encouraged us in that work and by which we hope to encourage others as well. And so I pray that this would just be a fruitful conversation as we consider your work in our own lives and how we can share it with teenagers and with other youth ministers, just encouraging them to keep proclaiming the gospel of grace, to keep pointing to your son, Jesus. And so we ask just for your presence with us in this time, that you would be just working in our hearts and speaking through our words to one another, to encourage each person that's here and to help us grow in ministry together. So we give this time to you, Lord, and we pray in Jesus' name, amen.
Okay, quickly before we get started, Chelsea, are you able to, when you click on participants, see if somebody's needing to get in?
Probably not.
Okay. I think I'm the only one that can let people in.
I think you are too.
Trying to figure out multitasking here. Oh, there's somebody right now. Okay, so I'm just going to be multitasking throughout this. But let me tell y'all just how this is going to go. We're going to try to really keep it to an hour. First, I am going to just talk and give y'all some points about writing as a ministry. And then we're going to get into that Jen Michel article that we sent you guys. Was everybody able to read that? We're not grading, so if you didn't, that's not a huge deal. But do you know nod your head if you know what I'm talking about, like you knew that we sent it out. No? Oh, dang. Okay, wait.
I'll put it while you're talking, Charlotte, I'll put it in the link.
Oh, huge. Okay.
Yeah, even if you haven't read it, it'll help you to be able to refer to it kind of as we talk. So
that's a great idea. Yeah, it's definitely one of those things that once we get discussing it, you can kind of be skimming while we're talking.
Yes,
maybe not put it in the talking, but yeah. Okay, so look over in the chat section if you didn't get that. So we'll do that, and then we will have some time for question and answer. So if y'all missed me saying this earlier, as we're speaking, if you have questions, shoot them down in the chat section, and we'll address those at the end. And there's a couple of times throughout here where I'm going to ask y'all to write things down, and it just occurred to me that are examples of things. Write those in the chat section so we can all see. I'll point out when I get there. But let's get started. So one of our goals as writers and editors on this blog is to engage our readers, right? Not just with practical information, but with the gospel. We want to pour the gospel into our readers so that they'll pour it into their students. So how do we do that? That's what we want to talk about today. How do we catch our readers to make them stay on an article and read it from beginning to end? This is something I'm hesitant to tell y'all because I don't want to make you sad, and I think it will. But somebody once told me that people read on the internet in the shape of an F, where they read the beginning and then sort of read the middle and then fade out. Sometimes it's in the shape of an E, where they'll be caught in the beginning, sort of filter through the middle, and then read towards the end, which is so depressing, right? Because we put so much work into these articles. So how do we just get them to read in a straight line, just the whole thing? These are 3 pieces of advice that I have for y'all today, and they are not conclusive. These are just 3 big things that I think of. So number 1, audience. You probably, if you've ever taken a writing class, you've heard this, and there's a really good reason, because if you know your audience, if you're writing to your audience, you can engage them in a better way. You can keep them reading. Okay, this should be easy at Rooted because we have a really specific audience: parents and youth ministers. And of course, like through social media shares and everything else, we're going to grab people who don't fall into those categories. But our main audience are parents and youth ministers. So if any of you, for those of you who've written for the blog, you can attest to the fact that really digging into your audience is a lot harder than you might think. So my advice, before you sit down to write your article, make sure you've specified your audience in your mind, which is going to help you specify your message, which will help keep your reader engaged, right? That's the goal. So let's quickly work through an example so I can kind of show you what I mean. Let's say you want to write about Christian suffering. This is a super common topic, really extremely important, but it's also really extremely general, right? There are tons of very weak articles on this subject because writers don't have an angle that's geared towards a specific audience. So here's where I'm going to ask you to think about examples in your own mind. And if you come up with something, there are no wrong answers, guys. Maybe shoot it in the chat section. How can you specify a topic or a thesis like Christian suffering to a rooted audience of youth ministers? I'm going to give you a second to think about that, and then I'll tell you some audience-specific topics that I thought of that are not rocket science, but they are audience-specific. So how do you talk about Christian suffering to a youth minister specifically? Here are a few ideas that I thought of really quickly. I didn't put a ton of thought into this. Instead of just Christian suffering, we're talking about how does a youth minister walk with a teenager who's going through suffering in their lives, right? That's really specific to your audience. Or what about why is it important for youth ministers to teach their kids a theology of suffering? That's huge, right? I mean, look at the world we're in right now. Kids need to know how to suffer, and they need to have a theological basis for how to do that. Audience specific. A third way is ways you have suffered in ministry. We have all suffered in ministry, in a specific ministry context, and how does the Lord work through that? So do you see how honing on your audience can actually like give you the thesis you're looking for, right? The more specific your audience, the more specific your message, which is my segue into point 2, detail. There's an author named Leslie Jamison who I love, and she teaches creative writing. And every year at the end of her class, she makes a cake for her class. And on the cake, it says, be more specific. And I think this is maybe the number 1 piece of writing advice I can give anybody. Be more specific. Hang on, let me check to see if I got anybody waiting. No. Okay, be more specific. A way to catch your reader, to keep them reading, not in the F shape or the E shape, is to paint a picture with your words in such a way that the reader cannot look away. They got to keep reading. You've captivated them. And I'm not telling you to use more adjectives necessarily, but it might be a helpful way to think about it. Okay, so quick example. Don't just tell us you went on a retreat to the mountains. Describe the setting. Where were the mountains? The mountains were 6 hours away in North Carolina. how did the setting add to what you're about to tell us? The mountains that were 6 hours away in North Carolina were this serene and peaceful backdrop to what would in a day's time turn into a total disaster. Okay, so use specific details. Another example, don't just say your student was struggling at school. Tell us that her best friend ditched her to go to a party with popular kids, or that her grades had started to drop because of what was going on with her parents at home. Details help captivate a reader's imagination. Be more specific. It is so easy in practical or faith-based articles like these to generalize, both in lack of detail and lack of a specific audience. And I think sometimes I think people do this because they think they're going to rally a larger audience by speaking to a general audience. But that's not actually how it works. You're actually going to lose your audience because you're writing in a bland and boring article that readers are unlikely to finish reading because they've read it before. The same goes from when you're talking about theology and the gospel. How can you be more specific in the way you describe the good news? Can you use details and descriptions that feel new and exciting and captivating? Right? This is ministry. Writing is ministry, just like preaching is and teaching. So striving to add these details into your writing is good ministry because it's honing your ability to pour the gospel into your audience, to keep your reader attentive and engaged so that they actually get to the good news. I think about that a lot with articles that are missing some of these. Your reader never actually gets to the good news, right? They never actually receive what we're trying to pour into them. So when it comes to detail, honestly, like any of these points, I think it's important to look at scripture itself, which is abundant with detail, specifics, metaphors, similes, right? The same Bible that gives us creation. I mean, think about the detail that's in creation. We can't comprehend that. The same Bible that gives us creation, full familial lineages and family trees, also tells us that Jesus didn't just sweat leading up to his arrest. He sweat great big drops of blood. And he wasn't just anxious, he was in anguish. And he didn't just sweat blood and anguish in any old garden. He did it in the Garden of Gethsemane. So be more specific. Use vivid, exciting detail. And then my last point to captivate your audience is narrative. So another way to captivate your readers is to use narrative. Story. I'm always wanting youth ministry writers to do this more often. And this is so funny, but it seems like it's a lot easier for parent writers to do this. I've noticed this in our articles. Parents are constantly using stories from their children. And I think there's probably something to do with that has to do with sort of permission from the kids, right? A parent can more easily get permission from their kids. And that's a conversation for another day. But I am longing for youth ministers to be able to do this in the same way. Like, I want to come away from every single youth ministry article having had either a tiny or an abundant glimpse into your ministry. What was it like? What are the things that you do? What are your strategies? What's going on with your kids? There's so much narrative in your lives. Like, youth ministries, like, we have the most stories of anybody that I know. I could tell stories about my youth ministry days. The fire extinguisher exploding on the bus in the middle of the highway. I mean, all the things, I mean, we're all laughing because it's true. You have so many stories that are simple or profound, right? There's tons of ways you can approach this. So look to scripture here too, if you need convincing that narrative is really important to storytelling. The Bible is a story. It's the detailed, specific story of God's love for sinners, the story of his grand rescue of his people in the person of Jesus. And Jesus uses story constantly too, right? To get his point across. Look at the parables. So story, I think, is critical. I cannot emphasize this enough. So here's another thing I want you to write down either on your paper or in the chat section. Think about ways you can incorporate stories into a youth ministry article. It doesn't have to be specific, like you don't have to tell us your stories, you can. But write your ideas down as I'm sort of giving you thoughts here. These are really general, right? You can write stories about retreats, something that happened on a retreat. I just told y'all one, right? The fire extinguisher exploded. Got a lot of ones involving cars for me with youth ministries. The keys got thrown away from the church van, or like a flying jar of pickles crashed on my windshield, and again, in the middle of the interstate leaving New Orleans. So many stories, retreats, mission trips. These stories can help illustrate your point, right? Talk about a particular student and their struggles. I know that there are issues here with students being, you're concerned about students being able to identify themselves. We can work with you on this. There are ways that you can change your details so that a student could not identify themselves. We understand that, like, yeah, you're not wanting to throw any of your kids under the bus, but so many of your experiences with students can really help other youth ministers who are in the same situation. So that's really the biggest one that I want to see is people talking about, specifically things that are going on with their kids and how they're dealing with it. So another example, maybe how you used to do ministry that didn't work, right? I feel like all of us have that, like, oh man, I thought that this is how I would do it, and that was a disaster. And I realized that was not how God is calling me to do youth ministry. Stories about an interaction with a kid or a volunteer. So here is an example of the most basic minor example possible, and I'm doing it from an article I just wrote, which is funny. I'm telling you this one because it is literally like the bare minimum story, and I think it still has high impact. I just published an article on earlier this week, Monday or Tuesday, I don't know, but it's about contact work. It is a super practical article. There's nothing mind-blowing or genius about this contact work. But in it, you get to see a sliver of how I was doing things at the time as a youth minister. Just a small little glimpse into my story, which I obviously cared about contact work. And in particular, I mentioned two stories. One, how I used to do a weekly morning breakfast with a group of kids who were not going to be interested in a Bible study. That's helpful, right? That's helpful to a youth minister to think of, like, oh, wait, I have that group of kids. They're not ready for a Bible study, but I can still hang out with them on a weekly basis. We just went to breakfast. And this was 2 sentences. That's it. And then the other one was a weekly card game that I did with another group of students, okay? Those are stories, right? And they're helpful because they show you a handful of things. A, it's important to get together with kids. B, it doesn't always have to be theology-based interaction. And also just the element of detail, the element of adding in those stories is like a tool to keep a reader engaged, right? It's sort of, what's the word? Like probing their imaginations. It keeps them engaged. It's not general, it's specific. I didn't just hang out with kids doing non-theological stuff. We went to breakfast, and I think I specifically said it was breakfast at a place that was down the hill from their private school. Details. And we met at a coffee shop to play a game of cards every week. So these are not grand, meaningful, vivid stories, but they're little baby story strokes in this broader picture of how I was approaching contact work in youth ministry. So again, not only does this give my youth ministry audience specific ideas for their own contact work, the specificity is a tool that keeps them engaged and concentrating. Okay, so sum that all up. I know I just feel like I fire hosed that at y'all, but audience, know your audience. Detail, be more specific. And narrative, tell us your stories. The article doesn't have to be a whole story in and of itself. That's great too. We love that. It can also just incorporate stories within the larger picture of what you're trying to tell us. And I really think you guys honing this, again, this is a ministry. your writing is a ministry in the same way that your preaching is. And you have a pretty large audience on this blog. And so honing that is actually, I think, going to filter into your preaching and your teaching in a way, because these are probably really similar things that you would use to work on with that skill as well. Okay, Chelsea, do you have anything you want to add there before we move on?
I was just thinking about the audience piece, back to that one in the beginning. One of the things, and I think this actually applies to the narrative part as well, maybe the details too, maybe all of it, but one of the things that I like to tell our writers, when I can tell they're struggling with this, like when we get a really general article that has great content, but isn't necessarily honed in to the rooted audience, I say, take the position of a coach. Like, you may not always feel qualified to coach other youth ministers, but you are, because you have a particular experience that not everybody in the field has, and we all need to learn from each other. So if you can kind of imagine yourself, I think when you're looking at all three of these things as, how am I going to coach this reader to approach this the same way I did, to approach it in a different way that I did, to learn from my mistakes, to learn from this scripture that I've been feasting on, and really, really try to think about taking that like kind of encourager posture, but also that coaching. And I think that can help to hone all three of these things, but maybe particularly the audience piece.
Something that comes to mind also while you're saying that is, right, like all of our greatest fear when we're writing or we're preaching is like, this has been done before, like the Christian suffering. Who hasn't written about Christian suffering? How can I do that in a way that is unique? And one thing I really like to tell writers is it's unique because you're writing it. Yeah. And so you're writing it from your own voice, but also your own experiences. And that's, again, where narrative comes into play. Nobody has your story. Nobody has your experience. Nobody has done ministry the exact same way you have. And that inherently makes it unique. So don't shy away from that. Sort of like Chelsea's saying, like, as if you're a coach, you're coaching from your viewpoint, and nobody out there is Ben Beswick. Nobody out there is Chelsea Erickson. You have not lived the same lives. You do not have the same experiences. We've got one constant, and it's the gospel. And, so that comes to mind.
Yeah, and I think we all know from our own experience in youth ministry, we feel inadequate so much of the time. We're looking for somebody to give us some insight or some wisdom from maybe a different perspective than we have day to day. So, yeah.
Well, should we move on to the Jen Michel article?
Yeah, let's do it. So if you don't have that in front of you, I did just put it in the chat a minute ago as Charlotte started talking. And if you haven't read it, it might just be helpful to pull it up on your screen, or if you have a way to quickly print it out, so that you can be following along as we talk about some of these things and maybe noticing. But, usually when we meet for the Rooted blog writers pre-conference, or sometimes we just have a little meeting together during the conference, we sometimes critique each other's work, which is really fun, helps us all to grow as writers. We figured on an hour blog or an hour webinar, we don't really have time to get into critique of one another's work, but it can be equally helpful to critique an article together. And so that's what we thought we would do today. Jen Pollock Michel is a wonderful friend of Rooted. And so there's so much that we love, just full disclosure, we love her writing. But I think it'll be great to just look at this together in light of what Charlotte has just shared, these 3 points, maybe in particular, as we talk about how can we be better writers. So let's just start off. Let's look at those 3 things in particular first. Does anyone, as you're reading this and now you're thinking about what Charlotte has shared about audience, detail, and narrative, are there things that you notice as really strong or maybe could be stronger in this article pertaining to those 3?
Or even looking for examples of like how she did those 3 things.
Yeah, perfect. A specific example would be great.
The whole article has kind of a good narrative arc to it, that it is telling a story. So that was helpful, but in some ways the details could limit the audience. Maybe that's not a problem, but I just did notice, in one sense, it opens with great detail. My friend lives in Toronto's hipster West End. She goes on, it's great detail. At the same time, as a living in Sioux Falls, you're kind of like, I don't want to read about hipsters in Toronto's West End. I kept reading, but it wasn't the catch for me. And I'm like, oh, I wonder what problems they're having. For better or for worse, there's lots of details in there that kind of filled out the story. So
that's great, Dan. I think thinking through both sides of that when you share details, right? Like, is this going to alienate a particular audience in some way, or is it going to draw them in? And it could do either, depending on the example. So that's super thoughtful. Lisa, I saw you had a comment. Do you want to share that, or was it Lisa or April? Let's see.
Yeah, just her opening hook. You could, even if you haven't been to Toronto, you just get a sense of it. And I'm in her world for this moment. Mm-hmm. And I think that, I felt bad for her friend. I'm not going to lie.
Yeah.
I agreed. I felt like this is where I think narrative is really smart, is it's not just an article about bailing on a meeting, which I felt so convicted by this article. I was like, oh my, like I thought that her ultimate point, for those of you that didn't read it, was sort of like, let your yeses be yeses, and I think she easily could have not incorporated that story. It could have been an article about why we shouldn't bail on our engagements. That would have come across as law. It would have made us feel really bad. Instead, she tells us a story about how she bailed, and she gives us rich detail about that story. We know her context. We know generally both of their kind of lifestyles. So anyway, I think that is a really powerful way to do it, is say, like, I'm guilty of this, I did this, and this is why it's problematic,
I like the way you said it too, Lisa, about it bringing us into her world. Mm-hmm. I don't know anything about hipsters in Canada, but I feel like I, could identify with what she was talking about. And yeah.
Oh, Bill, I see you waving your hand. Oh, you're on mute.
Can you unmute yourself, Bill?
Yeah,
oh, there you
okay. Tell me if you think this would be helpful. I have a background as a professor. In fact, I got my PhD at UT Austin.
Awesome. Okay.
Yeah, and I taught future teachers, and I've trained lots of people. So I have a background in education and as a trainer in the corporate sector. And I think the way I would approach this is by giving an example. In this case, she is the example. I'm thinking of our daughter. She's the kind of person who has the personality that did this as a kid growing up. Because she wanted to please everybody. She couldn't say no to anybody.
Yeah.
And so she was always getting herself in predicaments where she said yes, 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 and she couldn't do all the yeses. She's now 48 with 4 kids, and she's learned to say no. So I think what I would want to do here is use this as an opportunity to help people go through a process I call learn, unlearn, and relearn. The Apostle Paul describes this in Philippians 3, where he was the Pharisee of Pharisees and how he learned to become that. And then he had to unlearn it was all rubbish, had to give it all away, give it all up in order to relearn a saving faith in Jesus Christ. Okay. And I've used this a lot in my life and in my teaching. So that you're not only sharing a story, which happens a lot, but why does it happen? It's not that she's a hipster or anything like that. It's part of her personality. And if she doesn't learn to deal with that, she'll keep repeating this until she unlearns it and relearns another way of responding to people.
Bill, that
Um,
sounds like it could be a great article.
Mm-hmm.
I like
Yes.
your learn, unlearn, and relearn
Yeah.
framework.
Well, it is
Great use
absolutely,
ministry article.
it was absolutely powerful. I was conducting a training session for a client, and my company is called Mentoring Solutions. And so I was demonstrating my mentoring model, which is equipping the protege with what the mentor knows and empowering what the protege wants to learn and do and become. And both are necessary, equipping and empowering. And the person who volunteered to demonstrate a process that they were going to then practice started off by saying, I have a time management problem. And she just started describing all that. She was a mom with young kids. She took them to practice. She'd just gotten promoted. She was learning her new job. Her husband was a businessman. He wanted her to go to dinners with his business clients. And she was of an Asian background. She was helping in the Asian Community Center. I mean, she couldn't say no to anybody. and in the process of mentoring her, I helped her understand that she had to unlearn having to say yes to everybody in order to gain their approval. Because she said, if I say no, they won't like me. And I said, well, how do you know that? So I just asked a whole bunch of questions to lead her to realize that she had to unlearn a style of functioning where she always had said yes. She had learned to do that to get friends and approval and so on. But she was at the point where she was going to blow up. I mean, literally blow up. She just had too much. And so I guess what I'm trying to say, I like to bring in a personal element. So there's a story there, but then do a little teaching of how to do something about the story. So you're not repeating the story all the time in your life.
Mm.
I don't know.
Yeah, that's great.
So April and Lisa both had comments in the chat. I don't know if y'all want to say those out loud or.
Yeah, let's say, because those are great comments too.
Yeah.
April?
There we go. Had to unmute. I just love the way that she came alongside her readers versus telling her readers what they should or shouldn't do. She says, hey, I'm guilty of this as well, and we're all in this together.
Mm-hmm.
I think it invites and welcomes her readers in versus sounding preachy and pointing fingers at other people.
Yeah. So we can say, oh, me too. Wow.
Yes.
Gotta do that. Yeah.
Right? There's that C.S. Lewis quote, right? Somebody quote me. I don't remember what it is, but it's basically like saying the relief of hearing, you too? Me too. You know?
Oh,
Yeah, the moment you make a friend
Yes.
is when you say, oh, you too.
Yes. And you know, nothing like that. Talk about another sort of like tool by which you are captivated is by seeing yourself in somebody else's story. And you're like, like for me, I'm like, oh, I'm such a flake. I do this too, you know? And it makes me more open to hear what, not the negative thing she's saying, but the sort of relearn, like you're talking about. Who said that? Bill. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And then Lisa, you had a great point that I love too about our broken world. I don't know if you can speak up to share that, or I can read it if you don't want to, but.
It just kind of follows up on actually what April was saying, that alongside that we felt the weight and both of the initial story, but also, and I think we've all been there in ministries that have this, you know, this promising start and then it peters out. Yeah. So it's not this story that's got this, but don't worry, at the end we had 1,000 women, you know. It was, I talk about in my own story, just the testimony of the middle. You know, we're not sure where it's gonna go, but we know that God's in it. And so I don't have to have it tied up neat in a bow for it to be a gospel story. And I felt like she did that with us to say, you know, it was kind of hard. And we can all go, yeah, but then that juxtaposition of the faithfulness of God,
Mm-hmm.
I think, against just the common sorrow of brokenness was a beautiful, I found it very moving, and powerful the way she concluded that.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah,
she
I
sort of
agree, Lisa. Maybe we
diagnosing-
can, oh, sorry.
I was saying I like what makes me think of like what you're saying makes me think of like she's like diagnosing herself, which is really diagnosing all of us, and then in juxtaposition diagnosing God, you know, which is he's, you know, the antidote to our terrible sinful diagnosis. And it's powerful.
Well, let's take a couple more minutes to think of other things that you either really loved about this or things that maybe didn't draw you in as much as a reader. We can go to those three that Charlotte talked about: audience, detail, and narrative. Or if you want to zoom out from that, just observe some things that were really helpful as a reader, or maybe not as much. So Mel has a comment here. Do you want to say that out loud, Mel?
Sure. It's probably my personality, but when I read the article, I found the story. I loved it, but I thought it was distracting. I wanted her to tell me the premise, the theme of the article, the tension that she was writing about instead of the story first.
I think that's
what
so
I want.
interesting.
Yeah.
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 Yeah, I just read your comment before you spoke and was like, yeah, that would have been great. Totally. And may have like not kept, you know, where Dan got distracted by the hipsters. We would have already been brought in. We would have already been caught by, like you said, the tension of it.
Yeah. I mean, I'm like a lot of you guys. I'm a youth ministry lifer. I'm 66 years old and I'm still a youth pastor.
Love that.
And I wanted her to tell me. Thank you. Oh, shucks.
You need a trophy. Yeah.
But I wanted to know what she's writing about first, and then to just tell me a story.
Yeah, that's good feedback. I think that's really
good feedback. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. And it's such a common phenomenon that she could have started with that. You know, she could have led with, here's the problem in our world today, and oh, by the way, I'm part of the problem, you know.
Yeah.
Let us.
Yeah. That's good.
What else did y'all find helpful or not?
I was actually going to say, not to be the, contradictory voice, I really like the way that she structured it. I just found it really simple. I found it to be, she diagnosed the problem and then gave a solution. And I always like a good narrative hook. That's, I guess it just depends on, reading preference, but that she drew me in instantly. And then I too, Charlotte, felt so convicted by this article. So that kept me engaged. But then I also, it was just, here's the problem, here's the solution. I liked that a lot.
That's great.
I liked the way she had two very different examples of bailing with those two stories. The personal one-on-one relationship bailing, and the other, the group bailing. It makes, I think, it more relatable in different levels. And I also really like the fact that she sort of, her challenge that she put out there is just one sentence at the very end. She just leaves you with that, which I think is strong.
I'm having to go back and look at that.
I agree with you about the one sentence at the end. I think we're talking about the same one.
Yeah.
The very last sentence.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. And then there are a couple other little things where she kind of leads up to that and alludes to the gospel. That I was thinking, in rooted articles, and Charlotte, you kind of mentioned this, but we like to see a strong gospel explanation or tie-in or hook of some kind in every article that we publish, even when it's super practical. Charlotte's that she wrote last week, she also talked about like how Jesus came to be with us, and so that's why we want to be with our students. So we always want that theme of like the finished work of Jesus to be in our articles. And I thought this was such a good example of a way that can be done. It was so simple, She talked about Jesus' own words, and then she talked about God's faithfulness to his people. This sentence, in other words, God never bails on his people, never reneges on his promises. And then she gives that last, what simple witness might we, the church, offer to the world by speaking a reliable yes. I would say from a rooted perspective, the only thing I would want to add to that is to specifically mention the work of Jesus, but I loved the way that it was simple. It was just, she's not trying to overcomplicate it. She's just saying it in a simple, thoughtful way that draws people to like, oh yeah, isn't God beautiful? Like, don't we want to be like him? So
I also think like something that I think is interesting, if you think about like what's the takeaway? What is a really simple takeaway that somebody's going to get from this? And like, I feel like I have a new phrase in my mind from this, which is a reliable yes. Yeah. A reliable yes. Like that's so powerful. And I'm like, oh my gosh, my yeses are not reliable right now. Mm-hmm. And that's an interesting thought, is to think about like what's going to stick. What's the thing that's going to stick? And like you said, that comes right after we hear about like the most reliable yeses of all, like Jesus is God and Jesus are a promise keeper. God is a promise keeper. I mean, in the person of Jesus, he is a promise keeper. Yeah.
Well, we haven't talked about audience at all. And I also am curious to hear what y'all think about the title. So maybe we can talk about those and then kind of wrap it up. I don't know how we're doing on time, Charlotte. We probably need to go to questions soon.
We got about 15 minutes.
Okay. So just quickly, any thoughts you had about the audience? Dan kind of mentioned that a little bit, and then the title.
Maybe here's a question. Who do you think her audience is? This is a little tough because it's Christianity Today, which is her audience is Christians. But I think you could still probably get to a more specific audience than that of who she's writing to. Who do y'all think? Is it people over 50? I don't think so. I think it's Christians under 50, probably younger than that.
Younger, yeah.
Is it women more than men? I kind of think it's women more than men. I don't know why but that's how, maybe it's because she's a female writer. I don't know. Maybe that's like sexist or something, but I'm like, I just think
a little bit. But her examples are about women. And so I think it's maybe more relatable to women. Mm-hmm. Maybe there's a different like flavor that it takes on for men that looks a little bit different. I don't know.
Ben?
Oh, we can't hear you, Ben.
We can't hear you.
Huh.
You want to type it? Type it.
We could hear him earlier.
I know.
Oh, Lisa and I are in agreement about that. The examples were all women.
Yeah. Which is maybe why it sounds like the audience is more for women.
More for women. Mm-hmm.
But I think it, surely applies to all of us, to children.
I know it applies to my male students as much as to my female students. I can say that.
All right, Ben says, the detail about the text sent, the day has run away from me. Oh, makes it a bit more relatable to men as well.
Okay.
Yeah, the day has run away from me. And I think the context of busyness, right? That is a societal issue, the sort of idol of busyness. And I think that makes it more relatable to men too, which is probably like the day has run away from me. That's what, yeah.
Just the ease of sending a text. We can all relate to that.
Yeah.
Well, what do y'all think about the title? Did you find that pulled you in, or? Okay, so Dan says, I like the contrast of tone in the title. Totally agree.
I do too.
Yeah. And I actually love the way that CT does subtitles, so you get a little bit more about what it's going to be about. But do you feel like it gave you enough to know what it was going to be about? To draw, or at least to draw you in? I think for me, what I like about, I'm big on titles because I do think that they can hook the reader even before the story, right? So I think this title tells us accurately what the article will be about, but it has just a little bit of intrigue that draws us in.
Yeah.
When I first read it, and it was Anna who sent it to me. And when I first read it, I thought maybe it was going to be more about cancel culture. And then, so I was kind of intrigued by that, but then I was like, oh, it's about, this other part of culture where we're bailing on each other all the time. So I think it's just something to consider as you're writing. We love to see that you've submitted a title. Like, we're always happy as editors to work with you on honing that. But I would say you want to make it specific and you want to make it clear to some extent what you're going to be talking about so that someone reads it and says, yes, I need to read that article. I need to hear what that's about. That's going to apply to me. But I think when you can have a little bit of intrigue like this, thou shalt not bail, what is that going to really tell me about? It can draw the reader in. So, and I've noticed, our articles tend to get picked up by other publications and kind of highlighted on other sites when they have catchy titles. So just a little encouragement. I mean, we can always work with you on it, but it's just something to be thinking about as you're writing.
Yeah, like as we talk about like how we captivate a reader, we can't get them at all if we can't get them to click on the title. Right. And I think that you're so right. The detail, it is a detailed title because it is like you said, it's a little mysterious. And like Isaiah said down there in the comments, there's this tension because it's a question. And questions can be good titles too. Like you can have a title that's entirely a question. So yes.
I think sometimes people are nervous to do a catchy title because they're afraid it'll be clickbait. And I think we do have to be mindful of that, right? That we're not wanting to promise something in the title that we're not actually going to deliver in the article. So it's good to be cautious about that. But that kind of tension that you mentioned, Isaiah, or the contrast that you talked about, Ben, those are like really fun things to do because they draw people in. So.
I think that something else too to note is I wonder if sometimes people want to give a general title, maybe not super consciously, but because they want to draw in a broader audience, like we talked about, sort of like people not wanting to eliminate readers from the title. I don't think that is, I think just let that go. Detail is always better. I really believe that. Or we will cut detail that's not better. Don't worry. But you'd rather have, like, more is better. You would rather cut back, I mean, we would rather have to cut you down than have you not incorporate detail. So anyway, as far as I'm trying to say that in title, a broad title is not, in fact, speaking of Christian suffering early on, I feel like a lot of Christian suffering ones have vague, I've read that before titles. So like, how can you say it in a way that is specific and interesting and captivating? And like this one gives us some tension and curiosity.
Well, great insights, everyone. I want to make sure we can get to some questions. So, or further comments too, but thanks for engaging with that. It's fun to process together what makes it a great article.
So, okay, y'all, does anybody have any just general writing as a ministry or writing for Rooted, just questions about what makes a good article? Really anything. I mean, the floor is open. Nobody?
I kind of have a question about focus that kind of plays off the article, because there's a part of me that thought it could have been an article about busyness more than bailing. And that's why I even thought she did a really good job of keeping it tight, keeping it focused when I know if I were in the process of writing on this, I would have easily fallen into the trap of a long digression about busyness in our culture and dissecting that, which is worthwhile and interesting. So I thought she did a really good job of focusing, but I'm picturing being in the process of writing before you have this good end product that you go, oh, I know that was a good thing, but you're making these decisions about focus. What help can you provide in making those decisions that help focus, whether you're writing or, I mean, I think this even applies to preaching and teaching. You have to make decisions to focus, but I don't always know how to make those.
Yeah. I think I see Anna is on the call right now too. So we probably all three have maybe something different to say, but I think that is where your thesis is really important. And this doesn't have to be like a 5-point essay, like when you were in elementary school, having a clear thesis, but knowing what your article is about. And her article is about bailing. And she definitely talks about busyness, like you said, but she doesn't go off on a tirade. So we need to know a little bit about where bailing comes from, which is a busyness culture. But the article isn't about busyness culture. It's about bailing. And so I think that having a really clear thesis, so a lot of times those decisions for me as a writer happen in the middle of what I'm writing. I'll maybe go ahead and go on the tangent. And then in the aftermath, look and be like, that's not what this article is really about. And I've got if y'all have heard of the writer Anne Lamott, she has a saying, kill your darlings. You may love that little bit. You know what I do? I cut it and I put it in another document. And I say, you know what? I'm going to write the article about busyness next week. And I'm going to save that bit that I wrote because I love it, but it doesn't serve my thesis here in this particular article or sermon or whatever. So I don't think that it's a matter of you just are able to do that from the beginning. I think these are decisions you make along the way. And for me, most of the time, I make the wrong decision first and then have to go back and be like, nope, like that just didn't work. So
sometimes that's part of the editorial process too. Like I'm thinking about one of our best writers last week, and I encouraged her to cut something that was really thoughtful. And I was like, I feel like you have another article in you about this topic, but it's kind of distracting from what's being said in the rest of your flow. So I think sometimes we need each other for that too. Certainly I find that in preaching and teaching as well. Like sometimes I've got to like check my points with somebody to say, do these all actually fit together? Or am I just excited about this one and I want to hang on to it? So
let me tag off of what Chelsea just said to say, yes, we do that all the time. Literally maybe every other week, tell a writer, that's another article, cut that out. However, I want to encourage all of you guys to be self-editors. This will serve you so well. Your articles will be 1 million times better if you can send them to us as honed and as if you've been self-critical first, then we're working with a much more finalized product. And what ends up on the blog will be 10 times better if you can be self-critical on the front end. And it is a really hard skill to hone. But maybe even especially when you have editors, because you think, well, they'll tell me what's wrong with it. But that's just not the way we're going to get your best work. You've got to do the work on the front end beyond just writing it. You've got to really practice revision. It's an art. It is hard. It is not easy.
Yeah. Often means reading it out loud to yourself.
Or a spouse. Yeah.
Sorry, Anna, you're going to say something?
I was going to say the same thing, read it out loud. I always hear my rabbit trails and I hear my sentences that are way too bogged down if I read it out loud, even just to myself, I think that's super helpful. Sorry to join the call late, and I think I probably show up as Razor Mac 12, but my name is actually Anna.
No, you're Anna today.
A hand-me-down from my son, of course, computer. I see that Lisa has a question here too. Do you take articles that might be devotional for youth workers? And that's a really good question, especially in 2020, because we have done more of that during COVID, and things that are more devotional for both youth ministers and for parents. So we're not opposed to it. I think that what I would suggest, that's not our primary goal. Our articles are designed to encourage people in the gospel, but also be very practical and give people tools that they can use in their ministry. But sometimes that tool is they need just to receive some ministering to themselves. So if you have an idea for a devotional, just shoot one of us an email and say, I'm thinking about writing this. You know, what do you think? Is there for example, we had one that was fairly devotional that Kendall Connor, one of our steering committee members, wrote last week. It was on Romans 5, 1 through 5. It was really good. Not terribly practical, but very devotional. And of course, about endurance and hope. And but that was one that she had kind of delivered in a meeting. And we were like, hey, please write that up. So we're not opposed to it, but we don't do it a lot. So if, I would submit an idea beforehand. So
I want to say too, just to encourage April and whatever your idea is, I have always, I've been working for Rooted for 5.5 years on our blog. And I have always said, when I was a youth minister, I didn't want to read the practical stuff. I would have wanted somebody giving me a devotional. So I think you should pitch it to us because that's what there are youth ministers out there that just need some encouragement, you know? So I say go for it. It may not be the one that goes viral, but somebody out there may need to read it. So sorry, Anna, I didn't mean to negate you there, but
it's absolutely true. And actually, Rebecca Langford's on this call, and she wrote one that it was back in early COVID times that was purely, strictly devotional. And it has legs like no other article I've seen. It's just every week it shows up. People are still reading that article. Is it about Psalm 42, Rebecca? I think it was. Anyway, it's really, really strong. So yes, definitely.
Oh, Bill, email addresses. Here, I'll type everything in.
Any other questions we can answer or comments that y'all have? While Charlotte's doing that.
It's fun to see your faces.
And new faces too.
New faces, absolutely. Welcome, welcome.
New friends, old friends. It's great.
And I'm actually right now getting a notification that I have a brand new article from a brand new writer who came to us after the conference. So I can't wait. It's just really fun for us to get to sort of meet you that way and hear your voices and start to work with you in that process. And, you know, maybe someday we get to go to a conference together and we feel like we're old friends at that point. So it's pretty fun. It's pretty fun. We are here to help. You know, when I started doing this, Charlotte did my onboarding and she said, you know, editing is a ministry. And that's really how we approach it because we want people to help us be better writers. And we want you to be better writers and communicators. And we're all trying to walk this gospel road together and help each other, you know, say this in ways, say what Jesus means to us in ways that will really communicate. And so, you know, we're really just in this together. And I learned so much from your articles, both in the content of the articles and in the process of editing them. So, yeah, we're just super appreciative that y'all are here and, you know, writing for Rooted. So.
And this is our job. This is, okay, Bill, to which person should we send an email? Anna is the editor-in-chief, but you can email all of us. We are all editors. So you could include all of us or you can ask Anna, but please reach out with questions. Like Anna said, we love working with you guys and building up your skills. And there's no stupid article or subject or question. And we have, over the years, watched more and more writers just grow to be beautiful communicators. And we're just excited to continue to build people up and to all of you. So please keep writing. And even if you want help on writing something that you don't know if it's blog ready, but you just want help working on it, we're so happy to do that and probably convince you that it is blog ready. And yeah, we just love this. So
Thank you guys.
yes.
Grateful for you all.
Thank you.
We all have a great weekend. Do we want to, Anna, will you pray us out?
Yes, I absolutely will. Thank you, Lord, for this time together in quotation marks. And we know that we are united by your Spirit. And we're just, we're grateful for the ministry of writing, that you have called us to be writers, that you have called us to participate in spreading your gospel in this way. You are the Word. And we love your words. And we just pray that you will help us to be better communicators and better lovers of your people through the words that you give us to say. I pray that everyone on this call will just enjoy health and rest and have joy in you this weekend. We thank you for this time together. In your holy name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys. Y'all reach out for anything. We're here. Great to meet y'all. Have a great weekend.
Bye, friends.
Bye.